Hello and welcome. This is a lecture review for the William Stallings Effective Cybersecurity First Edition book. Again, this is a lecture review using the material offered by the publisher Pearson VUE. All copyrights belong to them. This is for educational purposes only. Again, the textbook is Stallings Effective Cybersecurity, a guide to using best practices and standards, first edition, done through Pearson VUE Education, ISBN number 13 97801 3477 2806. So again, copyright belongs to the author and publisher. I am just doing lecture reviews on the PowerPoints for each of the individual chapters. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on in. Chapter 4 is about security management. Here we're looking at the information security forms, standards for good practices. We're going to be describing what good management encompasses. We're going to be looking at several key elements. An organization should also provide a sufficient group of senior managers or senior management, such as like a CISO, basically with the authority and the adequate resources for the entire organization to protect and to strategize in information protection and information security. The CISO, or similar individual, is responsible for supervising the security-related projects, promoting security awareness throughout the entire organization, managing risks, developing a comprehensive as well as approved security policy. So that's kind of what this chapter is in a nutshell. So let's jump on in. So that means let's talk about the security management. So the security management basically establishes, implements, monitors the information security program and the platform and systems and management systems under the direction of a senior personnel, normally a CISO or some type of information security manager. There are more and more governance requirements that are actually dictating that you have both a CISO and an information security manager, because security is no longer taking a second seat to other C-class executives. Security is starting to be realized as throughout the entire organization is a requirement. Security management will involve multiple levels, and it should go from the top down. And they should complement each other. It shouldn't be departments fighting one another. There should be a single vision for the organization brought to you through the executives or the C-class, the C executives. And then from there, everyone working towards the same goal. At least that's how it should be realistic. So why does it need to be top down? Typically because security costs money, so there needs to be some type of capital planning. So this is basically a decision-making process that ensures the appropriate amount of investment is in technology support, technology protection, and technology security that integrates the strategic planning and the business goals are aligned. This will deal with budgeting, procurement, management of IT, and all of the technology support areas throughout the entire organization, ensuring alignment between the mission, the business, and ensuring that IT actually supports both the mission and the objectives. Security management is also outlined by a number of sets of compliances. Here we have the NIST IR 7359 Information Security Guide for Government Executives, and this will provide a very useful summary of tasks that comprise the information security management. Although addressed more specific to government executives, this is at least a general functional area for security managers and cybersecurity program officers that should be made aware of. So things like security planning, capital planning, awareness and training, compliance requirements, performance measures, contingency planning, disaster recovery planning, incident response, configuration and change management, risk analysis, risk assessment, vulnerability analysis, vulnerability assessment, as well as key security products and services acquisitions, meaning they need to be able to purchase the appropriate products with actually giving it planning and thought. And we can drill down into security planning and capital planning, but most of these are pretty self-explanatory. Acquisition is again purchasing. Contingency planning is operational. We're going to be diving into business continuity a little bit later. Performance measures are more of a baseline to ensure that things are actually being measurable and achievable. So when you say, oh, the network should be 10 times more secure, 10 times more faster, we have to have performance measures to be able to measure that. And I understand that saying internet or the network will be 10 times faster is not the most accurate or the best way to put it. Is just as an example, looking for appropriate measures. So what is configuration management? Configuration management is the process of controlling modifications to assets, essentially, and that includes the documentation process as well. This will provide sufficient assurance that the systems are protected and that all assets are protected against the introduction of improperly modified items before, during, and after any new equipment implementation. Change management also goes with configuration management. Change management actually talks about being able to set up a structure so you identify what changes are going to be made, and then you actually lay out the plan as well as the metrics to ensure that the plans are properly executed. And this also then it would include a fallback plan so that if a issue does arise, there is a way to recover and fall back to a operational state. So there are other useful guides for security management. You can use ISF, which does recommend the functions encompass the following core responsibilities of a CISO, and that again, company or organization-wide, consistency throughout security strategies, support, monitor, and project-based functions. They are going to be the focus point of those, as well as reviewing all external and internal requirement for those functionalities. And again, the consistency is so that everyone is on board. The support function, that's going to be act as a clearinghouse for security advice. It's going to be the business managers and project management as needed within the terms of security. You're going to promote security awareness. You're going to develop the standard terms and agreements for all contracts. You're going to evaluate security implications of new initiatives, oversee risk management and risk assessment, and set the standards for cryptography and data protection. Monitoring is going to be, again, looking at trends, develop awareness, and looking at how the business trends can align with security and how security and the technical staff can align to business needs. And that includes things like security solutions, standards, regulations, and where appropriate legislation. Projects are going to be, again, anything relating to security-related projects the CISO should be involved with, or someone from his team. And again, internal and external requirements. Basically, the CISO is going to manage the implications of laws, regulations, and contracts, as well as any internal requirements that have been identified. Alright, so moving on, our security plan is basically formalized documentation that provides the overview of security requirements, compliance requirements, and requirements of technology normally related to information support, information systems, and it also will describe the controls, administrative, technological, physical areas, or planned controls for meeting said requirements. The security plan is again that formalized document that lists out all of the appropriate security protections that your organization then now meets, or will, at least in the short term, move towards meeting. Now there's lots of resources for developing your security plan. NIST has the 818 guides for developing a security plan for FIPS, or Federal Information Systems. This will indicate, again, the purpose, the resources, the alignment, all of that fun stuff. The System Security Plan also delimitates responsibilities of individuals and what roles everyone does play in the organization. It also then lists expected behavior of all those individuals who have access to that system. And this then ties into things like the acceptable use policy development for the organization. So, our policies are kind of invading all other areas for basic protection. Lastly, the System Security Plan is the basic documentation of the structured process. Why? To ensure that controls and security are properly in place, as well as they're being cost effective. And that's really subjective, because I've definitely worked with organizations where cost really wasn't a concern, but eventually cost does become a concern. You need to make sure that the resources you are using to protect your assets are appropriate. You don't want to spend, $10,000 to protect a $5 mouse. Eventually that will get caught, and eventually that does get kind of thwarted away. So NIST 818 does go a little bit deeper. It does recommend each organization has separate plan documents with several different elements, things like information systems, names, identifiers, system owners, authoring individuals, rights and permissions and roles and responsibilities, security categorizations, information categorizations, classifications as well, information operational statuses, information systems types, description and purposes, systems environments, interconnection and information sharing, related laws, regulations, policies, procedures, and guidelines, existing security controls, planned security controls, baselines, metrics to measure those baselines, as well as information security plan and completion dates, as well as development plans for those systems so that if necessary they can be rebuilt. Here is an example of security plan, stages 1, 2, and 3. And again, this is just very broad, very big overview. Most of these plans are circular in motion. You identify in stage 1, you analyze in stage 2, you implement in stage 3, and typically rinse and repeat until you have all areas of protection that are now secured. These types of documentations allow for the CISO to oversee all of the security projects throughout the organization. The CISO should also coordinate the process of developing and approving these plans. One good description for such a process is the Federal Enterprise Architecture Security and Privacy Profile, OMB 10, and that is what we are looking at now. Here we have an additional NIST 865 life cycle, and here again, same thing as we look at the appropriate phases. We have the select phase, the control phase, the evaluate phase, and then we go through the cycle again and again and again. The select phase will identify and analyze each of the project's risks and returns before committing significant funds to that project. This is again more towards specifically capital project investments. control will ensure projects develop and investment expenditures continue. The project continues to meet the mission requirements at expected levels as well as cost and risk. And then evaluate will be comparing the actual results versus the expected results to seeing if everything was properly done. And then again, we cycle through as appropriate. So why are we doing this? A lot of this is because of cost. Oftentimes, management doesn't always equate to security with cost. Oftentimes, security is just seen as this black hole. So there needs to be an executive that can actually plan. And that executive's role is to actually plan those capital expenditures. With that said, here we have information security costs. Again, the direct costs, risk assessments, trainings, oversight for compliance, planning for contingency, security controls, physical and environmental controls, auditing, security, review, inspection, privacy, and so forth. Products and procedures, operational, privacy training, system upgrades, personnel security, physical security, configuration and change management, allocated hardware. That's going to be the security hardware, maybe camera systems, maybe infrastructure security. There's a lot here that can be broken down for costs. And again, this is not an exhaustive list either. These costs definitely allow for the development of other controls because, again, part of this is actually making sure that the investment choices are appropriate and they are procedural and their process involved and they're what's best for the organization. The cost itself needs to be reviewed. The cost needs to be verified, and that includes things like time it takes to complete tasks like risk assessment or vulnerability analysis. So it's not always cost for a piece of hardware, cost for a piece of software. Sometimes it's just hours for people analyzing content. We also have things like documentation. So our document types are security plans, strategic plans, security policies, security procedures, security guidelines, and so forth. All of this allows for long-term goal maintenance. That's the security strategy. The security plan is, again, what controls are in place and how does that meet the strategic goals. Security policies are related to the rules and practices and guidelines. Acceptable use policy are, again, that's just what you're allowed to do with those assets. These are just a few of the document types and the policies that might encompass those areas. Again, this is always a growing area, so they can change week to week, month to month, quarter to quarter. They're always growing, so do keep that in mind. So let's dive into these policies a little bit deeper. So the information security policy is, again, its purpose is to ensure all employees throughout the entire organization, especially with those with higher level responsibilities or roles, higher level roles, or have more access to additional assets, understand security, understand security principles, and understand and use their individual security related responsibilities. When there's a lack of clarity in our information, then it defeats the purpose of security. If we are not training our users how to protect themselves, then what good are the security controls? Oftentimes, attackers target individuals. That way, the individuals accidentally let attackers in. So the entire purpose of these policies are to set the tone for better protection throughout the organization. The lack of clarity is the big concern, or the purpose of the policy, specifically the security policy, is to define and to document everything that's expected from the employees and from the employer, as well as the roles and responsibilities of the individuals and the organization, such as and additional business parties like contractors or external vendors and visitors and so forth. Our security policy categories are things like access control, technical controls, data classifications, change controls, wireless policies, firewall policies, retention policies, cloud policies, and so forth. The security policy is, again, documented. That includes the overview, the background information, the purpose, why is the document created, the scope, what are the areas of the policies that are being covered, the target audience, a policy, which is going to be a complete but concise description of the policy, non-compliance consequences for violating said policy, any technical terms or definitions, and some type of change or version management for the documents. The nice thing is there's lots of templates for all of this as well. So for the security policies, you can do a lot of the templates based off of the SAN, and they're going to have like a clean disk, email, ethics, password construction guidelines, protections, acceptable use, clean desk, acquisitions, remote access. They're going to have a bunch of policy templates so you can customize to your organizational requirements. So a key thing here is to understand that these templates all help to identify the responsibilities, the roles, the actions, the principles, all of that. Because within these guidelines, within these policies, the scope has to be there, the responsibilities of the individual that are ratifying the documents. That way, the organization as a whole understands that, hey, this management approved these security controls, and then to take them more serious. So within responsibilities, again, that's ratifying policy documents. That could be the executive board, individual responsibilities protecting specific assets, and again, that would be outlining a policy that says, hey, if you use this asset, you're responsible to make sure it's protected. Principles are going to be things like relevant assets are identified and the appropriate evaluation is completed, that the asset is protected in respects to CIA, that all laws, regulations, compliance requirements, standards are complied with. Actions are basically any individual using the system is made aware of their rights and responsibilities for using that assets. Breaches are reported immediately. Auditing does occur. Acceptable use is, again, the documentation of behavior that are required, acceptable, and what is prohibited. And the responsibility for establishing, approving, and monitoring all of those policies and procedures and guidelines. So having the policies is only one step. The next step is actually being things like enforcing it. And in order to enforce it, you need to be able to monitor it. So there needs to be controls in place for monitoring the policies and enforcement. So the CISO should designate individuals or groups responsible for monitoring the implementation of these policies and reviewing them. You have to also then correlate violation. That way, you can make sure that employees are doing what they're supposed to be doing. The acceptable use policy, or AUP, basically will outline what is acceptable. It's a type of security policy targeted at all employees that have access to assets. It defines the appropriate behavior that's acceptable and what's not acceptable. The policy should be clear and concise and should be conducted of an employment for each employee to sign a form indicating that they understand the policy. There are a number of things here for reviewing our policies. So you can conduct a risk assessment for areas of concern. The risk assessment process would identify elements that need to go into the acceptable use policy. You could create the policy and again tailor to specific risks that have been identified. You'd have to distribute the acceptable use policy. You'd have to monitor compliance and enforce the review of it, and then enforce consequences. The most important thing is enforcement. A policy that's not enforced isn't any good. So let's review some best practices. There are multiple best practices that are broken down to security policy management discusses the specialist information security functions led by, again, a senior manager, the CISO, that is assigned adequate authority for resource management. This will include things like information security policies, acceptable use policies, information security management, information security functions, and legal and regulatory compliance. That will also include any security projects. Again, here, security management best practices is to be involved. You should be the go-to person for security management, or the CISO or the CISO's team should be the go-to resource for any organization that is dealing with security. All right, that is the end of this chapter. We looked at key security program areas, explained the purpose of content of security planning, representation of topics as it relates to security planning. We looked at discussing roles and typical content, as well as an overview of security management best practices. Thank you. So this concludes our lecture review on this book. Questions, concerns, or thoughts, leave a comment, make a statement, get a hold of me. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Remember that when we do some of this, it is critical that we ensure that we're answering your questions. Don't just listen and don't try to apply. Listen, try to apply what we've been discussing, and when possible, if you're not understanding something, say something.